Well, I would say that some of the biggest misconceptions about the Lewis and Clark expedition are that it was just a lark or a big family camping trip. Part of that is because they had a dog with them, they had a African-American slave with them, and they also had a young Indian woman. And so that kind of makes you feel like, well, this is just a big, large family. But actually, it was a military expedition. And it was sent by Thomas Jefferson to survey what was outside of what was then the United States. So they started at St. Louis and they went all the way to Astoria, Oregon, which at that time was just the Louisiana Purchase, basically. And the Louisiana Purchase pretty much stopped where they started getting into the mountains, and that's when they started meeting with tribes that they really didn't know were out there. So they were doing a survey for Jefferson, is what their mission was. It would have been 1803 to 1806 were the years that they did the expedition. There was many years in preparation for it, but we call 1803 to 1806 the years of the expedition. Jefferson picked Meriwether Lewis because he was his private secretary when he was president. And Lewis picked Captain Clark because they had worked together during the Whiskey Rebellion and they had become friends. And I believe the line that Lewis used when he chose Clark was, "I would prefer no one else other than you to co-captain this expedition with me." And although Clark never did get the rank of captain at that time, he was always called captain, and Lewis insisted that he get the same pay when they got back. And so in Lewis's mind, he was the co-partner. There was no distinction in rank. Well, their first months they were trying to make sure that the group that they got together, the 30 or so men, would be able to be up to the task. So they were really trying to enforce military order, to teach them what they needed to know to get the boats going up the river. They also wanted to make sure that there were no gentlemen's sons. They wanted them to be fit, single, young men, good hunters. There were some, let's just say, some indiscretions in the beginning. Some of them would involve getting into the whiskey, that they brought whiskey with them as part of the rations of the day. At that time, the military officers would give little thimblefuls, or they called them gills or gills of whiskey, to the men. And so there was a big storage keg of whiskey, and some of the men got into that, and that would cause, disruption in the ranks. And so they would discipline them, and one of the ways they would discipline them was have the men do a court-martial, and the men would decide who was guilty. And so that was another way of getting the men all together as a unit and saying, we will enforce discipline. And one of the things they did was called the Gauntlet, where they would have the men line up on either side, have a man shirtless run down, and these men would be whipping them with rods from their rifle or sticks as they went by. And then another way was just lashes well laid on, as they said. But because Lewis and Clark had firm disciplinary actions to kind of counteract that, that was all settled. By the time they took off from St. Louis, things were in working order and everybody respected both captains. So their experience in Montana was, it was either feast or famine. When they were on the plains and they were around all the bison, they would eat up to 9 pounds of meat a day. And a lot of people think, wow, those guys must have been huge eating that amount of meat, but they were burning it off so fast. I think they looked more like runners. Their bodies would have been pretty thin. But their experience in Montana, then they started getting towards the mountains, towards this area, and hitting the mountains meant, okay, it's not gonna be as easy as it had been. Even though they were poling upriver, they realized now we gotta transport all this stuff over the mountains in order to find that Northwest Passage, which, people say, well, they never really did find the Northwest Passage, but they did find the drainage of the Columbia, and they were able to get on the Columbia and then proceed onto the ocean. This particular area where we are right now, the Gates of the Mountains, when Lewis got here, it must have been late in the evening, because he said everything wore a dark and gloomy aspect. And it might have been that it had just rained, and so the rocks behind me would have looked a lot darker, and they were looking for a place to set up the camp, but they couldn't really find sufficient ground space for all the men to set up their tents. So they finally, we believe, got it on an island that's kind of right in the mouth of this canyon, and that's where they were able to stop for the night. So we always joke, yes, he came to the gates of the mountains and it was a dark and gloomy aspect that he saw. But if you're here today, look, it's a beautiful place and it's gorgeous. And so once they got into the mountains, they realized, wow, there goes all the game. We're not going to find 9 pounds of meat a day. And we have to rely on our Indian friends, our Native American friends, to help us find the meat and find the trail. And that was what both the Lemhi Shoshone, which is Sacagawea's tribe, and the Nez Perce were very instrumental in helping them. They met Sacagawea, or Sacagawea, as the scholars like to say it, in present-day North Dakota at a place called the Knife River Villages, which is where the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes lived. And she had been a Lemhi Shoshone girl who was kidnapped from her birth tribe and brought to the Mandan villages, where she was either traded or bought by a French trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau. So she was married to a French trapper when Lewis and Clark came through. And since they were looking for translators and people to interpret, they looked at him and they looked at her as also equal of being their interpreters as they traveled up the river. And she would have been, she delivered her son, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, I think it was February 11th, 1805. And I think he was like 3 months old when they started it out, and she carried him on her back the whole way. A lot of people, especially when it comes to having this young Native American Indian woman with them, are unfamiliar with the fact, a lot of times in American history we condense things down to their simplest element. And a lot of people are raised thinking, well, she's the one that pointed the way. She brought these white guys. Well, what happened was she was actually along for the journey, and just by her sheer presence, the other Indian tribes would see her and the baby, and they'd see the dog, and they'd say, this is really not a war party. These people are doing something else. They're not coming here to start fights. So just by her physical presence, she was kind of a token of peace. And then, there was a place over by Bozeman where she identified a pass that her people used, and she was able to say, this is the way we went, and Captain Clark calls her my pilot at that point. So there are instances where she recognized landforms and was able to say to the captains, I'm recognizing this. We're in the land of my homeland. Another place is down by Beaverhead Rock. So I like to say that her intelligence and her worthiness to the expedition was based on the fact that she paid close attention when they were sitting around the campfire with her people, and they would be talking about, well, we're going to go to where the bison are now, and we go by this route that goes by a big rock that looks like a beaver's head. And so, she could have really been almost a cartographer in her own right, just because she knew that she remembered the stories, and her people would travel seasonally depending on, if it was berry picking time or if it was time to go hunt bison. So they moved around according to where their food source would be. And then when she got to the Mandan, that was a whole nother lesson for her, because they stayed put. They were farmers, agrarians, and the women raised the crops. So she knew a lot about plants from them. So that's kind of her worthiness, I think, is a lot more complicated than people think. Misconceptions around Lewis and Clark are that they were friendly the whole time, that they always got along, that they were, brothers in arms and they were always united. I think that there were times when Lewis really tested the friendship of Clark, because he was kind of the more moody one, and Clark was more the glue that held the expedition together. Oftentimes Lewis would be on the shore gathering specimens or walking with his dog and hunting, whereas Clark was with the men on the boat with the day-to-day, orders and keeping them in proper form and all those kind of things. So these guys were really working hard, and also Sacagawea was working hard. They were trying to move all this equipment, all these boats, basically the whole Enlightenment up the river to get to find the Northwest Passage. And they were trying to do a job that one of the most brilliant leaders in our history had given them, had handpicked basically these people to do it. So they really did not want to let anybody down. And I think that added to their cohesiveness. There was maybe one guy who just, left the expedition. He went AWOL. But the rest of them, they were relying on each other, and they really believed that if they remained a core, a unit, that they would come home fine and they would get that land grant and they would be able to tell all these great stories. The important role that Lewis and Clark played in U.S. history was that they came out here and they told Jefferson what was out here. They were the surveyors. They were the ones that took the notes, that gathered the specimens, that tried to keep a list of the languages, the vocabularies of the Native Americans. They really were scientists, citizen scientists sent out to just get account of everything that they saw. And some things, like I said, the bison, you couldn't even count, there were so many of them. But they wanted to come back and give their journals as a report to Jefferson so that he could say, here's what we have, what we're going to encounter as our generations fill up the canvas, as he would say. Here's what's out there, this amazing wealth resource. And they were the ones that brought it back. They brought the report back that told Jefferson, yeah, that purchase was worth it.